Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Fernand Kartheiser. I'm a member of the European Parliament for Luxembourg, and I have today the pleasure and the honor to welcome two Danish friends with whom we are going to have a discussion on very interesting topics. I would like to start to introduce first Professor Bjorn Lomborg. He is, as I told you, from Denmark. He is really internationally renowned. Time magazine has selected him as one of the 100 personalities in the world, the most influential personalities. He is also a correspondent to an American university. He is the director of the Copenhagen Consensus, a worldwide renowned think tank, which is actually focusing on identifying the smartest policies to do good. And what is doing good, and we are going to discuss these subjects. Doing good means in particular on climate policies and on development cooperation. And the other Danish friend that I would like to introduce briefly today is another member of the European Parliament for Denmark, Kristoffer Storm. He is specializing on development cooperation, and so when we discuss this issue on development cooperation, we will have kind of a Danish dialogue on that issue. We know that Denmark is among those countries who are doing the most internationally, in international comparison, to help people around the world, and I think that will be a very interesting discussion too. Before giving the floor to Bjorn Lomborg, I would like to just draw your attention to his work. And he is a very active publisher, author of many bestsellers, and I have brought two just to show them to you. One about climate policy. I think it's the most recent one on climate policy, and with the title False Alarm. And the other one focusing on development cooperation, Best Things First. And Professor Lomborg is going to explain us what he wants to do and what is the objective of these books.
I'm going to summarize both books,
yes,
right?
Yes, a small summary. So Bjorn, you have chosen to work on climate and on development cooperation, and you have a very interesting and original approach. You are focusing on data. You are really not doing ideology, but you have chosen to focus your work on scientific methods. Please explain us how you want to proceed and what is the objective of your work.
Yes. So what I try to do is really just to say, and remember, I'm not one of the world's best economists, but I work with a lot of the world's best economists to identify simply and very sensibly what are the costs and what are the benefits of different policies. This is not rocket science. It's kind of sad that you have to introduce me. He's one of those guys who think in a very special way. This is how we all think. Yes. This is how everyone think about their private lives, the way they spend money if they work in an organization or if they work in a business. Why on earth would we not be thinking in the same way in government? Look, we have limited money, we have unlimited demand. We should think about where can we spend an extra dollar or rupee or kroner or whatever the currency is, and say, for every dollar spent, where do I do the most good? And it just happens, we know that there's a lot of places where you can do an amazing amount of good. We also know that there's a lot of places where you can waste a lot of money and do almost no good. We should probably do the first and Bjorn, the best things.
But Bjorn, is it not a little bit now, if I was an environmental activist, I would now say, well, you are calculating, but we have to save the world. Climate change is something so important and so dangerous to us, we cannot start calculating whether we have half a budget or an entire budget to help doing it. So why should we calculate when we have to save the world?
Yes.
From climate change?
And you're absolutely right. A lot of people will be saying that. First of all, of course, if this was actually a meteor hurtling towards Earth, it was going to eradicate all life. Of course, the calculation was to say, this is going to cost a lot of money, but it's actually going to save the whole world. Of course we would do that. And that's the exact argument that you're pointing out a lot of environmentalists would make. But climate change is not such a threat. Now, climate change is a real problem. It's something that's happening. It will have positive and negative impacts. Overall, all economic analysis show that it will have more negative impact than positive impact. That's why climate change is a problem. But it's not, by any standards, an end-of-the-world problem. So some of the world's best economists, so one of the most quoted climate economists, Richard Tull, The only climate economist to win the Nobel Prize in climate economics, William Nordhaus, have done meta studies of all of the studies that have ever been made in the world to say, what's the cost? And what they find is the cost by the end of the century on a realistic trajectory is that we will be somewhere between 2 and 3% less well off than we otherwise would. 2 to 3% of global GDP is not a small problem. But also put it in context. We estimate the average person by the end of the century, this is the UN estimates, will be about 450% as rich as he or she is today. So we'll be 450% as rich as we are today. But because of global warming, it's going to feel like we're only 435 to 440% as rich. Yes, that's a problem. No, it's not the end of the world. It's a much better world, but a slightly less, much better world. And when you hear it that way, you start realizing, well, of course, if we can avoid the 2 to 3% damages for, say, 1% of global GDP, great deal. But unfortunately, what we're doing here in the EU and many other places is to suggest, let's spend 10% of our GDP to avoid a small fraction of a couple of percent. That's a bad deal. And that's the conversation we need to have.
But now, you know that the European Union wants to have a net zero approach on carbon dioxide emissions. But if we succeeded in doing that for trillions that we spend on that issue with alternative energies and renewables and whatever, but what would be the effect on climate change if we had a net zero European Union around, let's say, 2040 or 2050?
Yeah. So let's first of all be realistic. Remember, the EU is a very small part of the world. Most of the rest of the world is not on board in this. The US obviously not anymore. China says they are, but they're not really. India, Africa, they want to get rich, and you can't blame them. So most of the world is not on board for this. The only real part is going to be Europe. We know how this is going to play out. If you plug in that the European Union went net zero tomorrow, and stayed net zero for the rest of the century. Remember, this would mean you guys wouldn't be able to, I wouldn't be able to get home. We'd probably starve. We'd definitely be unemployed. World would be a terrible place. But if we just for a second imagine that we did this, we know plug it into the UN's climate model. By the end of the century, the temperatures would have fallen by 0.16 degrees centigrade. So fundamentally, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Instead of going like this, it would go like, oh, wait, just a tiny bit of difference.
They'll be exactly the same. Yeah.
And this is not something you can doubt. This is just simply data. This is what the models show us. So for an incredible amount of money, Europe would achieve virtually nothing. That's not something to be proud of. That's something that will make everyone go, don't do like the European Union.
I think that's a very important point. But the other part of your work is about development cooperation. And there's maybe a question that I would like to pose to both of you, to you, Kristoffer, and then also to Bjorn. What kind of development cooperation would you consider to be efficient, useful for the countries with which we cooperate? I know that Kristoffer, in his latest books, he has focused, Bjorn has focused very much on things that are really not expensive, but have a tremendous impact, like fighting illnesses, illnesses that we don't know anymore in Europe, like tuberculosis, malaria, and so on. So that's an interesting approach. But for you, Kristoffer, what would be, in your eyes, an efficient and useful development cooperation?
For me, as an European, I think the best way to use our development aid is to create an economy in Africa that can actually stand by itself. So we don't have to keep continuing giving development into Africa. And how we do it now is not efficient enough because we split it too much. So we have to be more focused on fewer projects that we knew can grow and stand by themselves in a few years.
I guess that would have also an impact on migration from Africa if you have a developed economy.
Of course, that's one of the goals from a European point of view, because we have to protect our own values and our own culture, and we can only do that if we manage to somehow stop the migration to Europe, but we also have to stop the migration to Europe for the sake of Africa, because they need the people to stay in Africa, to work in Africa, and to build the African continent. So it's actually, in my point of view, it goes both ways when we're talking about migration.
Bjorn, you are very much an economist also. Would you agree with Kristoffer's analysis on, as a first target maybe to build up a good economic structure in Africa?
So it's very clear that you want people to succeed everywhere in the world. We want Africa to succeed. That's absolutely a great goal. I think we need to sort of temper our ambition of what's going to happen, what we can reasonably achieve. And there's a lot of things that go into making an economy effective. I also think we need to be realistic that any real development in Africa is not going to meaningfully change migration in the next 5 or 10 years. It's a little bit like the climate issue. It's about finding long-term, sustainable solutions. But I think where I agree most with Kristoffer and you is to realize we can spend the money that we really want to do good and spend them incredibly effectively, or we can spend them and do not very much good. I just happen to think, why don't we spend them where they do a lot of good first?
Yes.
So it's more about saying, we want a world that's better in many different ways. That's what people in climate wants to do. Let's do that effectively. We want to do many other things in Europe. Let's do that effectively. But when we're spending money on development aid, let's make sure we spend it on things that'll actually do a lot of good. So for instance, on tuberculosis, huge problem in the world. More than 1 million people die each year, and we know how to save them incredibly cheaply. We know how to deal with education. Education is terrible almost everywhere in the world, but especially in poor countries. We know how to fix this. It's about simple, cheap interventions like structured teacher planning and teaching at the right level. Very simple things where we could dramatically increase productivity and in the long run,
and that will help them
grow Africa's economy.
Yeah, I totally agree about that. And we also have to think about every time we use money on development, we take it away from something else we could use. And we have to respect that the European taxpayers' hard work. So I totally agree with you about we have to find something we can do for less money, but with more effective when we do today. And I have seen your 12 proposals. I can agree with most of them, I'll say. I do.
Do you think, Kristoffer, from your experience in development cooperation, that the countries that we cooperate with would readily agree to have Bjorn's program and Bjorn's priorities and say, let's implement this? It would help us tremendously and we could make rapid progress at low cost.
I'm sure about that, to be honest, yeah. I will, because it's very easy to take this 12 topics and point them out and say, yes, this can work for our country. And of course, if you can take away some diseases very cheap, it will give the citizens in these countries a feeling of wanting to stay at these countries because it's more healthy to be here, and then they'll have the opportunity to go to school, for example, as you also talked about, because they don't have to think about illness later in life. We'll give them a dream of staying in the country because they don't have to be afraid of what's going to happen in the next coming years. So I think most of the African countries will support a development policy as this, because the one we do now is we're coming to Africa and tell them, oh, we can do this, and if you do that, then you have to do, like we do in Europe, you have to do this kind of registration, you have to make LGBT plus zones, you have to do this, you have to accept this kind of marriages and so on. And they don't want to do that. They just want to develop, because right now they're so poor, many of the countries. So they are not in that level yet, and we have to understand that at the moment, the only thing they can focus on is development. And in some years, maybe we can start talking about maybe you should start focus on human rights.
I think we unfortunately don't have much time for today's broadcast, but I think that the few minutes that we spent now together shows already how terribly interesting it can be to ask ourselves whether we do our policy right in the best possible way, in the most rational way. And I just hope that you, with us, are now curious to discover this discussion and also Bjorn Lomborg's work and his books, because I think that we, as also as European conservatives in ECR, we should build on the work that Bjorn Lomborg has made and all the analysis that he and many hundred other economists, among which also Nobel laureates, have been working for years now. The Copenhagen Consensus is really a very important contribution to our work.
And if I can just very quickly add, obviously we don't just make the research for conservatives. This is really something that's for everyone. And again, this is not, economists don't come and say, you must do this. We say, here's a list of 12 amazing things. And the beauty is that most people in Africa, most people in the European Union will say, we like some of this. We don't like all of it, and that's fine. But this is like a menu, and here's some amazing things. Let's do some of them.
Yes, exactly.
Well, I can only say that I was always enthusiastic about your books, Bjorn, and very grateful also for your visit here in the European Parliament today. I hope it will not be the last visit. Thank you both, Kristoffer and Bjorn, for the few minutes that we could spend now together here and for your input. Thank you very much.
Thank you.